Hi everybody, this is Laura, City Scrapper. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel today. Today I have a layout that I made for a punched out Thursday to Die For. For this week's layout, I'm using a very old My Mind's Eye collection, and it's called Find Your Wings and Fly. And I'm looking at the copyright date. It's from 2013. I'm also using a couple of sheets of paper from another older My Mind's Eye collection called Fine and Dandy. I've die cut some pieces and I fussy cut some pieces, and I'm inking the edges of everything with some distress ink in Vintage Photo. At the beginning of the video, you may have seen I had a piece of pattern paper and it had a number of different patterns on it, and the patterns were in strips. So I cut out 2 of those pattern strips, and here I'm layering them on top of each other. The square that is a dark melon color, that was cut out using a die that I have in my stash. I'm using some chipboard pieces, and I just placed a whole bunch of the chipboard pieces on the layout. And now I'm starting to add some of the fussy cut flowers. And I fussy cut the flowers from another one of the strips that had a lot of flowers on it. On the upper right hand corner, I'm working on a little cluster. It has a banner that says Living the Dream, and then as I mentioned, I added some of those fussy cut flowers. And then to the chipboard flowers, I added a small off-white flower. And then I was thinking that I wanted to make the strip a little weightier, and I wanted it to have some definition. So I took some of this dark melon paper, and this was one of the papers that's from the Fine and Dandy collection, and I used a Fisker's punch. You could see it on the right there, and I punched a small scallop out of these strips of paper. This is the same paper that I used to cut out the square. Now, I had to cut out the square twice. I made a mistake as I was die cutting the first square, so I don't have any full strips, but I do have these shorter strips, and it worked out just fine to piece them together. I put some ATG adhesive on the front of the scallop strips, and then I'm just placing that larger strip on the top of the adhesive, and I'm making sure that the pattern goes in the same direction on all of the strips. And then especially because I'm piecing these strips together, I want to make sure that the strips look even on both sides. Now that those scallops are attached to the wider strip, I'm placing that thinner strip back on the center of the wider one. Now that I have the strip all assembled, I'm going to start working on the square that I'm turning on its side that I'm going to be using to mount my photo. So although I have that square turned on its side, I'm going to keep the photo straight, and that white piece of paper, that is a 4¼ inch by 4¼ inch square, and this way I can add a 4-inch photo to it, and there'll be a little border of white all around the edges. I'm making a cluster on the lower left hand side using a small piece of chipboard, and I like the size and the shape of that chipboard, but there's an odd graphic on it, well, odd for the layout I'm going to be making. It's of a rocking horse, and I'm not crazy about that, but for right now, I'm just going to leave it. And I wanted to add that yellow flower to the layout, and I finally decided that I would add it to the cluster on the right-hand side. But now I'm taking everything off the layout. I hadn't planned on doing this, but I noticed that in the background, it looked like there were layered papers, and I thought that it would be kind of cool if I actually cut some of those layers out and made them real layers. So I cut along where it looks like there's an edge to the paper, and I cut off the extra paper. You could see it, it's on the right. I'm going to do that on the right hand side and then on the left hand side as well. And now, because I have cut away part of the background, I take out another piece of pattern paper. I liked this lighter melon color paper, and I'm going to be mounting all the papers on this background paper. So again, I'm cutting along the edges where it looks like the papers end, and I'm making some layers. And then I don't cut that last piece right now, but I end up doing the same thing to that piece that's to the right of the layout right now. I use my scissors and I distress the edges of this larger piece of paper, And then I'm going to do the same thing to those smaller pieces of paper. I really want the edges of the paper to be very distressed, so in addition to distressing them with my scissors, I'm also adding some distress ink in Vintage Photo and add quite a bit of ink to the edge of each of these layers of paper. The layer of paper that I'm holding right now, that is going to fit underneath the larger paper, and so I decided that I was going to cut it a little bit shorter than the large paper that's already there. And then the last strip of paper that I'm going to add in a few moments, that will be cut even shorter. I like the way trimming the background down makes the layout look a little bit more asymmetrical. Sometimes I'm a little too focused on making things symmetrical, and I think that there's more interest and there's more for the eye to take in when there's less symmetry on the page. Not saying that everything has to be asymmetrical, but I think that it's nice to have some elements that are unexpected. So here I'm distressing and then inking that last layer of paper, and then I use some adhesive and I attach that down on the right hand side. As I said, I really wanted these edges to look distressed, so to add a little more distress in certain areas, I'm using my fingers and I'm ripping and bending and tearing the paper in some spots. I wanted to draw attention to the fact that these are actual layers, and so I wanted there to be a lot of texture. As I was working with the background, I realized that I really didn't need that whole sheet of paper in the background. I just needed a border. So I gutted that piece of paper, and then I can use the rest of the paper on another layout. I'm using that blue paper to mount all of the pattern papers to. I attach the gutted piece of pattern paper, and now I'm putting a fair amount of ATG adhesive on the back of the background that I've been working on. And make sure that that's lined up. And now I'm going to start returning all of my elements to the page. I'm ready to attach that strip down, and I just drew a really little tiny line just to make sure that I remembered where I wanted to place that strip. And now I'm putting some foam on this photo cluster that doesn't have a photo yet, but the chipboard that's on the right hand side, that of course is more dimensional than the rest of the pattern papers, and I have that tucked behind the pattern papers, so the foam helps to even everything out. I like the dimension that that gives the page. And then I had forgotten that I wanted to put a different color brad in each of the corners. And my first instinct would be to put the brads in before I put the foam down, but it ended up being just fine to punch the holes right through the foam and then put the brads down. So I guess either way works. And these are the brads that come with this paper collection. There were 4 different color brads, so I put a brad on each corner. And you could see there that I was using up all the little scraps of foam that I had in my drawer. I like to use larger pieces, but of course I never want to waste anything, so I use this layout to assemble a bunch of small pieces of foam. So even though it means that there are going to be 2 clusters on the bottom, I decided to move the cluster down. It was just starting to look too busy on the top. The flowers above the strip on the right-hand side of the layout were right on top of that cluster. And by the time the layout is completed, I think that the layout looks pretty balanced. I attached down these 2 chevrons to the right-hand side of the photo. And my thought at the time was that they're almost like arrows pointing to the photo. And there were also 2 chipboard circles, so I wanted to include those on the layout. So I put one on the lower right-hand corner and one on the upper left-hand, not corner, but on the cluster that's there. I add another banner to the lower right-hand side, and that one says Sheer Bliss. And I'm adding some more fussy cut flowers to that top cluster. I was looking for something else to go on the top of the layout, and I saw this hot air balloon, and I thought that this would go just perfectly on the top part of the layout. So I fussy cut the piece out, and I ink the edges with some distress ink. And there's a little banner coming off of that hot air balloon, and it says Follow Your Dreams. Once I have the balloon cut out and I have it inked, I decide to place it on the right-hand side of the layout. And I'm just using some ATG adhesive to attach it down. And now all of the major elements and embellishments are in place, and I'm thinking that I need to add some leaves to help finish the layout off. So you can see to the right of my mat there that there are 4 floral cutting dies, and then underneath it is the die that I used to cut out the square that's behind the photo. I'm using some forest moss, and I'm inking up 3 different piles of florals. I have one pile that is a dark green, then I have a lighter green, and then I have some white florals as well, and I ink the edges of all of those with the forest moss. I finally decided on this 4x4-inch photo of my daughter Danielle and me, and I really like this photo. This was taken in Cape Cod quite a few years back, and it's hard to believe I still haven't scrapbooked all of my Cape Cod pictures. We haven't been there in quite a while, but I had a few, actually some really nice pictures that I hadn't scrapbooked, and I'll be keeping those in mind for future layouts. The next day I came back and I did not like where I had placed that hot air balloon on the layout. I didn't want it to be so far away from any of the clusters. I thought that it would be best if it was closer to one of the areas where there's already something going on, so there aren't just a bunch of random items placed all over the page. So I didn't think of it before, but it was very simple to just clip off that little saying, follow your dreams, and put it on the other side of the hot air balloon. Now I'm working on putting those leaves on the page. I really like this stage of the layout because once I have leaves and florals added to the layout, I feel that it's starting to look like it's a finished product. So I really like this part of the creating process. I'm using the 2 different piles of green leaves right now. The white florals, those are kind of a finishing touch, so I'll put those on next. And I'm spreading out the leaves. I'm trying to make sure that there's a variety of both the dark and the light green leaves in each of the areas where I'm adding them. And since I have 3 different dies, I want to make sure that I don't have any of the same die cuts right next to each other. Once I have all the green leaves in place, then I start using the white florals. The white floral die is a great one because when you cut these die cuts in half, you can use both the top and the bottom. And because I want the white florals to be a small area of white on the layout, and then I also want them to be kind of an accent rather than the most important part of the floral clusters, I'm making them small, so I am cutting each of these die cuts in half and tucking them around each of the clusters. And I feel like that's very rare. A lot of times when I cut stems and floral pieces in half, I can use half of it and then the other half doesn't look like anything worth using, and I usually end up throwing that part away. So I really like this die a lot for that reason. It's a lot less die cutting. Once I had placed all of the florals on the page, I stepped away from the layout for a little bit, and then when I came back, I thought that the cluster on the upper left-hand corner looked a little bit too heavy, so I did go through and take out a couple of the leaves and spread the ones that were there around. I decided to move these chevrons or arrows down to that piece of chipboard on the bottom. I thought that they made the strip on the top look a little bit too busy, and then they also covered up that image of the rocking horse that just didn't have much relevance to this particular layout. Not that it wasn't a very cute image, it just didn't match with this layout. I'm adding some photo corners now, and I'm using a yellowish green colored pattern paper. And I use my EK Success scalloped photo corner punch, and I use this on so many of my layouts. I just really like this added touch, and I like the way it helps me to bring another color to the layout. In this case, it was a color that's already on the layout, but there isn't too much of it. I add a tiny blue enamel dot to 2 of the photo corners and to the 2 chevrons, and I put a bow on top of the photo, and that's the final touch. Here are some close-ups. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I am really enjoying creating layouts for A Punched Out Thursday to Die For. In the description box, you'll find links to the channels of all the other ladies who are part of this collaboration: Sonia, Kathy, Ronnie Sue, and Dorothy. And this week, for the first time, Scrappy Kathy will be joining us. So please check out all those videos, and I hope to see you again next Thursday for another Punched Out Thursday to Die For. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.